Alright, so DJI just updated their motion controller with this here, the RC Motion 2. It replaces the original motion controller that first shipped with the FPV drone. Gosh, it's been like 2 years at this point, so we've had this controller around for a while. It was due for an update, and DJI delivered with something that gives us much better control. Now, if you want to replace your original motion controller, you can pick up just the RC Motion 2 for $240. It also now replaces the original motion controller and all of the DJI Avata combos, so you've got now the Explorer combo that comes with the RC Motion 2, as well as the new Integra goggles that I have on my head. But you can go with the Pro View option that now comes with the motion controller too, as well as those upgraded goggles too that have some of the different upgrades. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I really wasn't looking for an upgrade to my original motion controller. I thought that this gave me everything I needed. It was a lot of fun to fly my drone with, but looking at what they've done here with the second generation makes me happy they've released this, because it gives us such better, more finite control over the drone that we're flying. I mean, think about it. The motion controller is like a first generation product. There's not many other drones out there that allow you to fly it with a controller by just using your hand, by just using motion, right? So we don't really have anything to compare this original motion controller to. Hence, I never thought that there was anything that could be better about it. Now, speaking of upgrades, let's take a closer look at these controllers side by side to spot the differences. The design remains unchanged with the same general button layout, but small improvements have been made to give you more control over your drone. For example, the accelerator on the back now allows you to fly the drone backwards, whereas previously you could only fly the drone forwards. We'll definitely check this out more when we get up in the air and start flying. On the side of the controller, the record button remains in the same spot, but instead of a tilt slider, we now have a wheel that allows us to change the camera parameters. This is also a clickable button that allows us to access those camera settings quickly. On the front side of the controller, the lock and mode buttons remain the same with pretty much the same functions, but the brake button on the original motion controller has been swapped out for a full-on joystick. This means that brake function now moves to the lock button instead. I'm really happy that they've included this joystick, and you'll see why as we get into our full flight. Now, as a couple of miscellaneous points, the power button remains in the same spot, the battery LED indicator on the top remains in the same spot, and you can of course charge the motion controller 2 with USB-C just like the first. So yeah, motion controller 2 is definitely a huge refinement over the original version, as you'll see when we get into our full flight. But before we do so, I quickly want to mention that if you're going to be flying with the RC Motion 2, you want to change the speed settings for the joystick as well as your reverse movement. When I first started flying with the RC Motion 2, I was really frustrated with how slow the drone was flying when using the joystick as well as when reversing, but I realized that when you jump into the settings, you can actually change the maximum speed in every direction when using the motion controller. So make sure you jump in there, change those settings before you fly so that you're able to kind of refine how the drone moves when you're actually using the RC Motion 2. Alright, so it's now finally time to jump into our full flight using the RC Motion 2. So I've got about 80% battery left remaining here in my Avata. We'll go ahead and start our recording. So now we're recording in both the goggles, the SD card in the goggles, as well as in the drone itself. Now from here, we will double press the lock button. This arms our motors, and usually with the old motion controller, we'd then hold the lock button and it'd come up to a hover for us, but we can now just go ahead and take off right with the joystick and shoot up. Now you'll notice right now, my joystick movements are very slow. Like, it's moving slow forwards, it's moving slow backwards, up, down, in every direction. But if we go ahead and change over our modes to sport mode, I now have this thing cruising. So I'm just pushing up on the joystick and we can fly up super fast at 11 miles per hour. Okay, so let's go ahead and cruise around. I'll tell you what, when I first flew with the motion controller on the original FPV drone, like it was my very first flight, I thought to myself, oh, this is cool. It's going to be fun to fly with. It's probably not going to give me that finite control that I want, but to my surprise, it was one of my favorite ways to fly the FPV drone just because of how unique and interesting it was. Like, in the same flight, in my very first flight, I started flying around and I was splitting gaps with the motion controller. So it's very intuitive. There's a bird. Ooh, man, that was close. So yeah, motion controller, ton of fun to fly with. The same like general principles are the same here. We just have, again, different ways to control it. So for example, we'll come to a hover here. If I wanted to, I can now fly backwards by pushing the accelerator here forwards. So now I'm cruising backwards at 18 miles an hour, but again, we're kind of flying blind here. So in my opinion, I wouldn't be flying backwards unless I absolutely knew there was nothing behind me. I mean, we're in a nice open area here, so flying backwards is no issue. And they also make it really easy to go ahead and stick your finger right in between so that you can either go backwards or forwards by just kind of flicking your finger forwards or backwards. I'm going to lower the controller a little bit just to get a little bit more comfortable. Looks like we've got a train that's pulled up here. So let's go ahead and cruise around the building, and then we'll go and we'll get nice and close to the train. Again, just because of how, like, natural it feels, I almost feel like I can get closer to specific objects than I would if I was using the regular controller. It gives you a different level of confidence, I would say. Like, we are cruising. This is a lot of fun. Also, you'll notice that sometimes it's a little bit jerky when we're actually inside of the remote controller, or inside of the goggles, but that'll of course get all smoothened out with Rocksteady. Now, I will say, the Avata is a lot of fun to fly with the motion controller, but personally, my favorite drone to fly with the motion controller is the FPV drone. It's so much more fast. I mean, it's basically double the speed. And yeah, it's so much more fun to fly with the motion controller just because of that speed that you get. It makes it more of like a rush. Now, let's kind of show off some of the usage of the joystick here. So, for example, if I wanted to come to a hover, right, I could push the joystick up to fly directly upwards. I could push it down to fly directly downwards, or I can move laterally from left to right, so I can move left and I can move right. So it isn't like a traditional joystick where I'd move forwards, left, right, and whatnot, but instead you're going to be changing all of those directions with the motion of the controller, and this joystick just gives you kind of like movements in, I would say, the cardinal directions, right? So personally, the joystick for me is good to get out of sticky situations. The same thing with the backwards movement of the drone is great, because if I get stuck, let's say I want to fly down here, for example, right? And I go and we'll move a little bit slower. Like if I get into a situation here where I'm just like way too close to the building, like what would I do? How would I get out of this, right? I mean, I could kind of move up and around, but instead if I wanted to, I could just go reverse, back up, move, point to the right, and then get myself out of it. So again, you get such better finite control over the drone using the joystick and using that backwards movement. Now we of course do have return to home with the motion controller too here, so the mode button, if we go and double press that, oops, we actually do the regular one press and then hold. This will give us an RTH. Personally, I enjoy using return to home when using the remote controller because I've had some issues with actually landing the drone in the past. You'll see the landing can kind of be a little bit finicky when using the motion controller. Now we're in the normal mode right now. This gives us a maximum speed with the Avata of like 17 miles an hour. We'll go ahead and flip over to the sport mode because again, I love that speed when using the motion controller. It makes you feel so much more immersed, I would say. Yeah, like usually for me, when flying with the motion controller, it's all about having fun. Like usually I'm not out trying to obtain cinematic footage when using the motion controller. This is just pure fun for me. We've got about 44% left remaining on our battery. Look at that bird right there. Let's chase it. I think it's a duck. Ah, it landed. Flying with the birds here. And then again, in this situation right here, like I could go and look like all the way up, and then I could press on that in order to fly the drone directly upwards, which, yeah, this works, but instead I could just stay level with my horizon and use my joystick. Fly straight up. I could then use the motion controller to move us around, and then go ahead and reorient myself. So again, that finite control is really what you get with the motion controller too. That'd be the biggest reason to upgrade if you have that original motion controller, is just for better control over the actual drone. Let's go ahead and chase or surf over that train one more time, and then I think we'll come back and we'll land. And again, you'll kind of see my annoyances with the landing of the RC, and really it's not just the motion controller too, it's just the motion controller as a whole. It's the way that it's built, it's the way that it's used. It does make it a little bit easier though with that joystick to come down and land. Let's try to go onto the left side. You do sometimes get that jerky lateral movement from left to right when you're using the motion controller, just as you kind of change your movement. Getting a little too close there. It's really cool though. I mean, you could give this to somebody that has never flown a drone before, and the motion controller is like such an intuitive way to fly that they'll pick it right up. I'm going to do one more little lap around. Again, doesn't have the speed of the FPV drone. All right, let's bring it back. We'll land. We're at 22% right now. All right, it's going to auto RTH. We'll hit mode just so that it stops. bring it on back. Now with the motion controller 1, the original way to land would be to look all the way down, right? Point there, hold the thing, land, right? Use the accelerator, but instead now we can just use our joystick, bring it down, land, and this is so much easier. It's so much more intuitive. Bring her on down, land, boom. All right, so motion controller 2 for me completely upgrades the experience of actually flying with the motion controller. Is it worth the upgrade over the original? Maybe. That's up to you if you think that all of that little granular control is worth the extra $240. But in my opinion, I'm really happy that DJI has replaced the original motion controller with the 2nd generation, and I can't wait to see what they do in the future with, different ways to control the drone, because this is a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the motion controller 2 in the comments below, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.